Okay, we're live. And good morning in Mexico. Good afternoon here in the United Kingdom. On behalf of the Center for Mexican Studies, UNAM UK, I would like to warmly welcome you all to our student seminar series organized in collaboration with the Mexican Society of Students in the UK. This series provides a space for early career researchers and postgraduate students to share their work, foster dialogue, and strengthen academic collaboration between Mexico and the UK and beyond. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Angélica Martínez Leyva, who recently obtained her Ph.D. in economics from the University of Warwick, and who will soon join the CREST in France as a postdoctoral researcher. I'm sorry if I didn't mention. Okay. His research focuses on gender disparities in labor markets, particularly in Latin America, and on childcare dynamics in the United States. She combines reduced form and structural approach to identify the mechanisms driving these disparities to evaluate the impact of policies aimed at promoting equality. In her seminar titled Job Flexibility and Informality, Dr. Martinez will discuss how labor regulations in Mexico restrict part-time jobs and how this affects caregivers and parents with young children, often pushing them into informal work. She will also share evidence and policy proposals that highlight the importance and job flexibility for gender equality and social welfare. Before we begin, let me share a quick note on today's format. Dr. Martinez will give a presentation of approximately 45 minutes, followed by around 15 minutes for questions and discussions. If you are joining us on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we will share them with the speaker. If you are following the session on YouTube Live, and you are also welcome to post your questions in the comment section. Our team will be monitoring them. We look forward to your participation. Dr. Martinez, thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Hi, Grecia. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. First of all, a big thank you to NAM UK for inviting me, and thanks to everyone for taking the time to join me in this session. My name is Angélica, and as Grecia mentioned, I recently finished my PhD in economics from the University of Warwick. And today I will be presenting one of the chapters on my PhD dissertation with the title Job Flexibility and Informality. And here I'm going to be exploring one of the key drivers behind why women are sorting into the informal sector. I'm really excited to share my work with you, so I guess let's just start it with this. So just quickly before I start, if anyone has a question, I think you can type it, and then I think Grecia will let me know. So you don't have to wait until the 45 minutes. So we can make this like more dynamic and interesting for everyone. Okay, so just let me start. Okay. So women value job characteristics that favor work-life balance more than men. And if we think about gender difference in compensation differentials, women tend to search for jobs that are closer to home, and they often sacrificing earning for shorter commute. But moreover, women's roles in childcare can influence their preference for shorter hours. And these often lead women to switch to part-time employment to accommodate for this need for flexibility. However, why not all jobs provide this work flexibility of shorter hours? Well, the reason is because providing shorter hours may be costly from the employers. One potential channel can be from the productivity perspective. Maybe employers don't want to hire part-time employers because they may think that they're less substitutable as a full-time employer. So with this, for example, in the US, there's some type of high-paying occupations that actually working shorter hours is not that easy. So because of this, women are more likely to sort into flexible occupations. But another potential channel of why it's so costly to provide shorter hours for the employers could be from the labor regulations. Sometimes labor regulation may increase the cost of hiring employers. For example, hiring an additional worker may be costly for the firms. But in the case of developing countries, specifically in Latin America, the informal sector may help mitigate the impact of these regulations, so it will reduce the cost of the firms. Okay, so now that I start talking about developing countries, one key feature about developing countries is that around 70% of all workers are informal. They work in the informal sector. And specifically in Latin America, women are more likely to be employed in the informal sector. This is not the case, for example, in China or India, where men are more likely to be informal, but here in the countries in Latin America, women are the ones that have these type of jobs. But informal jobs are not good jobs. Informal jobs, on average, they give us lower earnings and fewer social safety benefits. However, the informal sector may allow some women to remain employed upon motherhood. There's some research, for example, in Chile, that they found that women that are after giving birth to their first child, women in the informal sector are more likely to remain in the labor force compared to actually women that are in the formal sector. So these may be like the first step that suggests that informal jobs may provide shorter hours, and this can help women actually to balance work with childcare responsibilities. So what I do in this paper, and what are the two main questions that I want to address here? The first question is, are mothers, specifically mothers with young children, they're the ones that need to balance this work and childcare responsibility more often. Are mothers with young children more likely to choose informal sector due to this need for shorter hours? That would be the first question. In the second question that I want to address too is, how can public policies mitigate the need for women that choose informal employment? What type of public policies can governments enact to actually reduce the reliance of women in the informal sector? So to answer this question, I'm going to be focusing on Mexico, where around 60% of women have informal jobs. Okay, so what I do in this paper, and I'm going to be following the same structure in this presentation. I divide this paper and this presentation in three big parts. The first part I'm going to provide, and this is going to be the overview of the presentation. So if someone doesn't have time someone needs to disconnect in 45 minutes, pay attention to the next 5 minutes, and it's going to be the overview of the presentation. So to answer these two questions, I divide my paper in three big parts. In the first part, I'm going to give you some facts about informality and hours work in Mexico. The most important fact here is going to be something that I'm calling the informality gap. Women in the informal sector work 12 hours less compared to the same women in the formal sector. So here I'm controlling for observable characteristics. I don't see this gap for men, or this gap is narrower for men. Men in the informal sector work 2 hours less than the same men in the formal sector. So we can see that the informality gap shrinks for men. And I'm going to show you a lot of pictures about this. And kind of the second main fact here is I'm going to show you that formal employment is going to vary across occupation and hours work. So this is going to be really important because I'm going to show you that women are not sorting into occupations because of the flexibility. It's more that conditional on the occupations that they choose, they're going to sort into the sector if they're looking for this flexibility in hours work. The second part of the paper, I'm going to provide some empirical evidence for this. And here we're going to be thinking about two different shocks to the demand for shorter hours. The first shock that I'm going to be analyzing is kind of the motherhood shock. What happened to women after they give birth to their first children? To do this, I'm going to create a pseudo-event approach to estimate these child penalties. Here, my results shows are in line with the child penalty literature, but let me explain what it is in case it's not clear here. So here I'm going to compare what happened first to men and women after they have their first kid. So here my result shows that the probability of having a formal job decreases for women by almost 5%. But I'm not going to see changes for men, meaning that the men, after having their first children, there's not going to be any probability of moving to the informal sector, but actually there's going to be women are less likely or more likely to move to the informal sector. And these go in hand with the child penalty literature. But most important is in the next step, I'm just going to compare mothers that were before in the informal sector and women that before having a children, they were in the formal sector. Here, my result shows that mother in the informal sector, they can adjust their hours work by 3 hours more than mothers in the formal sector. So this is important. Why? Because here this evidence tells us that mothers can adjust intensive margin, meaning how many hours they decide to work. They can only do this in the informal sector. They cannot do this in the formal sector. So this is kind of the first shock that I'm going to analyze. The second shock, also to the demand for shorter hours, is going to be coming from the loss of childcare support. Here I'm going to be following Marco's methodology, and here I'm going to use the death of the grandmother to a shock to available hours. So we can think that mothers that live in the same household, they were taking care of the children. So they were having childcare responsibilities. What happened when the grandmother dies? The mothers are going to experience the shock of losing childcare. So the mothers that experience this shock are 17 percentage point less likely to be formal, and they have to reduce the number of weekly hours by 9%. So these two shocks give us the first step, this empirical evidence that suggests that women are sorting into the informal sector when they suffer this shock. And if they have to adjust intensive margin, they can do it exclusively in the intensive margin. And finally, to answer the third question, that it's how can public policies mitigate the reliance of women to sort into the informal sector? I'm going to construct a model of women's labor supply and sector choice. Here, my key assumption in my model is that in the formal sector, individuals cannot work below a certain threshold, meaning that if you're working, for example, full-time in the formal sector, you cannot actually switch to being part-time. Individuals are going to choose between time, what to do with their time, and they can either work at home, or they can decide to go to the market and work outside. And we're going to have two sectors, a formal and informal sector, and two different markets. We're going to have a goods market, meaning if you need to go for groceries, you go to the store and buy groceries, or you need to you go to buy stuff into the departmental store. This will be the goods market. But also we're going to have the service market. And this service is going to be exclusively childcare, meaning if you want to have childcare, there's two options. Either you go and buy hours of daycare outside, or you produce childcare yourself, meaning you take care of your children yourself in your house. But this is going to have a trade-off. The trade-off is going to be if you want to produce childcare yourself, these are the hours that you cannot work in the market. So you're losing wages. But on the other hand, you're not going to spend money buying these hours of daycare. But I'm going to be more clear when I arrive to the model. I'm calibrating this model based on data and this reduced from evidence. This reduced from evidence is all the results from the second part, all my empirical evidence. I'm going to use this, and this is going to help me to estimate an elasticity between the childcare in the market and the childcare produced at home. And finally, and this is the most important part of why I need a model, is I can evaluate different type of policies. The first policy is, what if we allowed the formal sector to be more flexible? So, as I mentioned, not all jobs, not all firms offer flexibility. One channel could be is because it's costly for them, right? Hiring an additional worker is costly. So, if we think about the government reducing this cost, maybe the firms are going to start hiring more part-time workers, or they will allow individuals to reduce the number of hours worked. If this happens, well, what are going to be the results? So if we allow the formal sector to be more flexible, the informal employment will decrease by almost 17%. And there's going to be a welfare across individuals that is going to increase by 1%. That's one potential policy that the government can take into account. But another policy, it's childcare availability. Let's think about the expansion of subsidized childcare. So what would happen if the government expand childcare? So the informal employment will decrease by almost 4%. So not as much if we reduce the labor market regulations, but we decrease informality a little bit. But actually welfare increases way more. The reason for this is because of the preferences that women or individuals may have of taking care of their children in their houses versus taking their children in the daycare. So maybe some women may prefer to just take care of their children their own. So the expansion of subsidized childcare may be not something that they may prefer. So these are the two policy contrafactuals that I'm going to be looking at. Okay. So these are going to be the three big parts of the presentation. And finally, before we go in more detail one by one, what's my contribution to the literature? I think my main contribution in the literature of gender difference in our works and preference for shorter flexibility comes from the fact that I show that this demand for shorter hours or for shorter working hours is more effectively met in the informal sector rather than specific occupations. Because most of the jobs in developed countries, specifically in the US, and all the work from Claudia Golding suggests that women sort into occupations because certain occupations are more flexible than others. Here in this paper, I'm going to show that it's not that the women are sorting into specific occupations. Women are not switching across occupations. Women remain in their same occupation, but they're looking for the flexibility across the sectors. So I think that's the main contribution of this paper. And finally, I think the second one that is more a little bit about informality and gender comes from document this important fact that is the thing that I've been calling the informality gap. There's an informality gap in the number of hours worked for women, but I don't see this gap happening for men. Or if there's one, it's way smaller. Okay, perfect. So now let's start with these three things. So as I mentioned, I divide this paper and this presentation in three big parts. I think the first part is just going to be more like pictures and graphs. So it's going to be like a little bit more dynamic. Then it's going to be these two different shocks that I'm analyzing. And third is going to be the model. Okay. Before I'm going to show you how the labor market in Mexico looks like, let me just briefly talk about the informal sector. So countries in Latin America are characterized by having high levels of informality. But what is informality, or how do we classify informal firms or informal workers? So basically, an informal firms or an informal workers are those ones that do not comply with labor laws and regulations. That's why if we reduce the cost of these regulations, maybe firms will prefer to hire more formal workers. But for example, from the side of for the workers, we can think that the workers are the ones that lack a formal labor contract. And this implies that they don't have access to social security or pensions. But from the firm's perspective, it's a little bit different. We're going to have an extensive margin and an intensive margin. A firm, it's informal as a whole if they avoid this registration and entry fee. Basically, they're not registered with the government. But we're also going to have an intensive margin on informality here, meaning we can think about a formal firm. So it's registered and to the government and pay this entry fee, but they hire workers without formal contracts. So we're going to have informal firms that just can hire only informal workers, but we're going to have a huge sphere of firms that are formal, that hires informal workers, and of course, formal would only hire formal workers. And this dimension is really important. And finally, and I think this is really important, is I think before people thought that this formal and informal sector were separate labor markets. Kind of the things that are happening in the informal sector were jobs that you could never find in the formal sector. This is not the case. Research shows that actually these two sectors are not separate markets. Actually, there's jobs that exist within the same occupation and firms. And this is really important because workers can continue in their same occupations regardless of the sector. It's not that they will have to switch occupation if you move from one sector to the other one. Is you can continue being a teacher, being formal, but if you want to be informal or you need to be informal, you can be a teacher in the informal sector. And this is going to be really important because it's going to allow me to see why women may sort into sector and not the occupation per se. Okay, so what's the data that I'm using here? So in this research, in this project, all my data is coming from the NOE. So the NOE is the Mexico Quarterly Labor Force Survey. This survey, it's a rotating panel structure, meaning I can follow household up to 5 consecutive quarter, so a year and a half. And this is going to be really important that it has a panel structure because I can actually follow households, so I can see how I can look at their transitions across jobs and across sectors. I'm going to have information in labor market outcomes for any individuals age 15 and older. So I'm going to know if they are employed or not, if they're part of they're inside the labor force or not, how many days that they work a week, how many hours they work per day and per week, and the hourly wage. But most importantly here is I know exactly if the worker it's a formal work, it's in a formal employment or it's in an informal employment. I do not create this variable. This is a pre-coded variable that INEGI creates. And the way they define a formal worker is if a worker is formal if they have access to social security, health services, written contracts, and for example, retirement plans. But this is important because actually see if the job it's a formal job or an informal job. Well, if the worker is formal or informal. I also have data on household time use and demographic characteristics. And this is important because I'm going to know exactly if the mother or the father or any individuals in the household, how much time that they spend in unpaid childcare, right? So I know if the mother, the father, the sibling, the grandmother is taking care of the children and how much time. And finally, my sample period is going to be from 2012, the second quarter to 2023, the third quarter. Okay, now let's go a little bit with graphs and figures. So here is going to be a quick overview about the labor market in Mexico. The graph on the left, I'm plotting labor force participation. The one on the right, it's the informality rate. The blue triangles are female and the green circles are males. So here we can see that women are less likely to be in the labor force. So on average, 45% of women are part of the labor force compared to like around 84% for men. However, conditional on being employed, this is women are more likely to be in the informal sector. So women are less likely to be in the labor force, but more likely to be informal. This informality rate is as a percentage of employed workers. I'm only looking at the universe of people that are working. So we can see that actually these trends haven't changed that much in the last 20 years, just a little bit at the end, and these peaks, especially during COVID. But around 60% of women in Mexico have informal jobs compared to 49% of men. So here I'm just going to take a second to mention that there's a lot of reasons of why individuals may choose to work in the informal sector. I'm just saying one potential explanation is the informal sector provides flexibility. Maybe men doesn't need this flexibility. So the reason why they select into the informal sector, it's another reason. But here, the only channel that I'm looking at is this flexibility in hours, and women are the ones that are looking for this flexibility and not men. Okay. Next, this is going to be one of the key facts that I have in this paper. That is what I'm calling the informality gap in hours work. Here, this graph shows the distribution on hours work for women on the left and for men on the right. The dashed line is going to be the distribution of hours in the formal sector, and the straight line is going to be the distribution of hours in the informal sector. So the first thing to notice is the graph on the left that is for women. We see that there's a large dispersion in the number of hours for women in the informal sector. So I don't know if you can see the cursor, but here we see that there's this gap happening for men. But when we compare to men, this gap is way smaller. But also something really important is if we just look at both of the dashed lines, meaning women formal and men formal, they have actually similar distributions in the number of hours worked formal. But in the informal sector, it's another different story. So these gaps that we see is what I'm calling the informality gap. It's large for women, but it's way smaller for men. So now let's put a number on these gaps. So here I'm just doing a linear probability model, conditional on people staying in the labor force, and I'm controlling for a bunch of observable characteristics. So let's just look at column 1. Here, column 1 tells us that women in the informal sector work 12 hours less than women in the formal sector, or women in the formal sector work 12 hours more. If we look at column 2, we see that this gap is way smaller for men. Men in the formal sector just work 2 hours more than the same men in the informal sector. Here, when I say the same men, is because I'm controlling for all these observable characteristics. Okay, good. But given that I can follow household up to 5 quarters, I can actually look at transitions. I can just look at the individuals that are moving from one sector to the other one within the same occupation. And something really interesting happened. If we look at column 3, we see that the women that move from formal to informal, they reduce the number of hours by 8.8 hours. Men that transitions, they only reduce it by 1.5. And the same story if we look at the transitions the other way around. If a woman, that will be column 5, if a woman move from informal to formal, they actually increase the number of hours by 10, but column 6 for men shows that they increase it by 5. So again, these magnitudes are always larger for women compared to men. But this again suggests that in the informal sector is where individuals can adjust these margins going down. Okay, So this is just to put some numbers to this to the distributions that I showed you before. Another fact here, it's that I want to talk a little bit about, it's how formal employment varies across occupation, okay? So on the left, I'm going to show you the share of formal employment by occupation. Here, actually, each one of these are dots, even though it looks like a line. Here I'm plotting each dot, it's a 3-digit occupation from the NOE. So I have 156 total occupations. And here I'm sorting occupation by formal employment. So we're going to have occupations that they have really high share of formality. So it will be the top right corner. And we're going to have occupations that they have really share of formal employment. So let's just put a little bit of names to these kind of occupations so it's easy to think about this. So this is going to be the table on the right. So I have in total 156 occupations, but here I'm just showing you 20 of them. And these are going to be sorted by the share of formal employment. So let's start with the first one. Which occupation has the least amount of formal employment? As everyone could guess, it would be food street vendors, right? Because it's also really hard to regulate. So only 2% of food street vendors are formal. If we go to completely the other, to the highest share of formality, it will be the one at the bottom, is the flight attendants. Flight attendants have the highest share of formality of all the occupations that I'm looking at. So flight attendants, 95% of flight attendants are formal. But as you can see, there's a huge variation of formality in each of in the occupations. So for example, if we look at gardeners, 38% are formal. If we look at social science researchers and specialists, like I guess it would be me, 74% of them are formal. So that means like 26% of them are informal. Something interesting, for example, is like government officials and legislators, only 42% of them are formal, meaning 38% are in the informal sector. But these give us a little bit of idea of why individuals can remain in the same occupation and switch across sectors, and also shows that these two sectors are not separate, right? They're like there's a lot of overlapping across them. Okay. And finally, I think this is the last fact from the first part, is that there's a negative correlation between the dispersion of hours work and formal employment. So here, dispersion in hours work is just going to be the standard deviation in the hours work. So let's look at the graph on the left. So here, again, I'm plotting hours work, well, the dispersion in hours work measured as the standard deviation, and the share of formal employment in the x-axis. We can see and each dot represents again one of the different 156 occupations. We can see as the share of formal employment increases, so as we move more towards being flight attendants, the dispersion in hours work reduces. So this gives us, again, this shows us that formal sector doesn't allow a lot of variation in the hours work. But now the plot on the right, I'm going to show you the dispersion also in hours work by occupation, but by sectors. So here the red triangle or pink triangle is going to be the standard deviation in hours work informal, and the blue one is going to be for formal. So here we can see that the blue circles are on average always below the informal one, meaning that there's more dispersion in hours work in the informal sector than the formal sector. Again, this adjustment and intensive margin, it's going to be easier if you're in the informal sector than the formal sector. And this is in each of the occupations. Okay. So the last comment here is the informal sector, rather than the within occupation, is the one that offers this greater variation in hours work. Time. Okay. Now, quickly. The second part of this project, now that I'm showing you some descriptive evidence and the overlook about the labor market in Mexico, let's just try to put numbers and empirical evidence on this. So here I'm going to talk about two different shocks to the demand for shorter hours. The one is going to be the motherhood, and the other one is going to be the loss of childcare support. So, as mentioned before, I show you that women in the informal sector work 12 hours less than women in the formal sector, and there's this negative correlation between the hours work and formal. But now let's try to put let's try to analyze this. So I'm going to do this, I'm going to use two different shocks to the demand for shorter hours. That is the motherhood, that is what happened after mothers give birth to their first child. And the second one is going to be the loss of childcare support via the death when the grandmother dies. So I don't want to take a lot of time here, but here just briefly let me tell you that many countries, especially developing countries, lack of high quality panel data. So to measure these childcare penalties, we want to have panels that long run panels. So to do this, I'm going to create a pseudo panel for men and women before and after the birth of their first child. And when I create this pseudo panel, now I can actually estimate the child penalties in the labor market outcomes. So I'm going to estimate the impact of children on women's labor outcomes and in men's labor outcomes, okay? And this is just a specification that I'm following. Okay, so let's just go directly to the results. So the picture on the left, I'm plotting the event time. So number 0, event time 0 is going to be the one with the dashed black line. This is when 1 year before the women have their children. That's going to be our baseline, well, the base time. So here I'm going to compare in the picture on the left, men and women after their first children, okay? And what's the impact on formality? So as we can see, the probability of having a formal job decreases for mothers by on average by 5%. So here we're just looking at the red triangles for women. We see that the changes in the formality rate decreases as time passes. But for men, that is the blue squares, it doesn't change across time. So this event of having a children is not changing the probability of men being formal, but it's decreasing the probability for women to be formal. That's one thing. But most important now, I just want to compare women in the formal sector with women in the informal sector. So this is going to be the picture on the right. And here I'm going to be looking only at working hours. How many hours a week women in the informal sector or formal sector works every week. So here I should have changed the colors, sorry, but the picture on the right, formal now is going to be blue and informal is going to be the red triangle. We can see that mothers in the informal sector adjust their working hours by 3 hours more compared to women in the formal sector. So here we're going to compare women in the formal versus informal. So they can adjust more hours, the women that are in the informal sector compared to the women in the formal sector. Okay, so again, this reflects this temporary flexibility in short hours that mother may search in the year after they give birth. So this is what we're calling like kind of the child penalties. Okay, good. Now, and here is going to be my second shock. So what happened when the person that takes care of the children, in this case, the grandmother, dies? Okay, so there's a lot of evidence that shows that the availability of family members as caregivers can let women actually increase the labor supply. So here I'm going to be following Marco's methodology, where he uses the death of the grandmother as an exogenous shock to available hours via childcare. The rationale behind this is I'm looking at three generational households, and the grandmother that was in charge of taking care of the children dies. So there's going to be a shock to the demand of shorter hours that now the mother may have. After after the death happened, how would the mothers will adjust? Okay. So I'm going to be comparing women with young children with women with older children, because the women with young children are the ones that need this flexibility more, okay? This is what like this empirical specification is showing us. So here, let me just go quickly to the results. So what happened? First, let's just look at column 2. Here, I'm comparing women that has young children with women with older children, where the grandmother where the grandmother dies and she was taking care of the children. So mother with young children that experience the shock are first in column 1, they reduce employment by 7 percentage points, so they're less likely to remain employed. Now column 2, column 2 will be formal. Here it tells us like women that experience this shock are 17% less likely to be formal. But most important is that women that experience the shock, they reduce the number of hours work by 9%. So there's going to be this adjustment and the intensive margin. And this adjustment and intensive margin, most likely it's happening in the informal sector, giving all the previous evidence that suggests that you cannot do these changes in the formal sector. And finally, column 4 shows if women are transitions, if they're changing occupations. And actually, I don't find any significant change that mothers are actually changing occupation. So I guess this work contributes to the fact that women find this flexibility in the informal sector rather than within occupation. So individuals are not changing occupations. And this result, especially this decline in the 9% hours, is going to help me estimate the elasticity between childcare market and childcare at home in my model. Just one last thing here is I do this for example, fathers or for men, and I don't find any results here. They don't change how many hours that they work. They don't change if they are more likely or less likely to be formally employed, or if they change, if they move from the labor force out of the labor force or not. So there's no effect for fathers. Well, there's no effect for men. Only effect I found is for mothers with young children. But again, this is part of the same story about like women with young children are actually the ones that need this flexibility. Okay, good. So I think I have 2 more minutes to go for the model and talk about the policy counterfactuals, but just like let's take a little bit one step back and think about what I have shown you in this presentation. So first I show you some facts about informality and hours work, and I show you that there's an informality gap for women, an informality gap in hours work for women, but is less for men, and that formal employment varies across occupations. That's the first part. In the second part of the presentation, I estimate 2 different shocks to the demand for shorter hours. I look at the motherhood, that is the event study around childbirth, and we see that there's a decline in hours work happening in the informal sector. And the second shock, to estimate also this shock to the demand for shorter hours, is the loss of childcare support. And again, the evidence goes in the same direction. Mothers are less likely to be formal and they reduce the number of hours in the informal sector. Okay, so with all of this, let's go to the last part that is going to be the model. And here, I'm just going to briefly, just in these slides, talk about how I construct this model. And most important, why I need a model. So the model is going to help me because I want to analyze but like different policy counterfactuals or different policies that the government can enact. But to see how much are going to be the magnitudes and what are going to be the channels, I need to make construct this model. So I'm doing a model of women's labor supplies and sector choice. So I have two sectors, formal and informal. Time use. So the individuals are going to have certain amount of time a day, and they're going to decide how much time that they want to allocate to each of it. How much time you want to put in leisure, how much time you want to put in home production of childcare, meaning you take care of your child in your house, and how many hours you want to work in the market, like having a job outside. And I'm going to have two markets, a goods market and a goods market and this service market that is exclusively for childcare. As I mentioned at the beginning, the formal sector, you cannot work below a certain number of hours, meaning you cannot adjust this intensive margin in hours work. And the childcare services can either be purchased in the market or produced at home. Either I take my kid and put it in the daycare, or I take care of my kid myself. And you can divide the hours any amount of time you want. Finally, my individuals are going to be heterogeneous, meaning they are going to be different in terms of the preference and the productivities, meaning some individuals are going to be more productive in the formal sector or in the informal sector. And overall, the formal and informal sector are going to differ in their average productivities. This is the way I'm solving the model, but I think just because of time, let me just skip this. But the important thing is here I'm going to evaluate two policy interventions. How reducing the constraints on the minimum hours in the formal sector, meaning reducing hiring costs or changing labor market regulations, and expanding subsidized childcare, okay? Okay, so this is a quantitative analysis. So I construct the model, I solve the model, I calibrate the model, and now what? Okay, so now let's think about what would happen if we allow the formal sector to be more flexible. Well, this will be the first column, changes in H bar. I should have put numbers here. But what this tells us is a 10% reduction in the number of hours worked is going to reduce informal employment by 16%, almost by 17%. Changes in welfare is going to increase welfare for everyone by 1%. This is compared to the baseline specifications. So this policy that is going to target labor market regulation is going to be really good at reducing informal employment if that's the goal of the government, okay? But what if the government decide actually to subsidize childcare or expand childcare availability? Well, if this happen, again, there's going to be a decrease in the share of informal employment, but not as big as the one before. So it's only going to reduce informality by 3.7%. However, there's going to be a huge increase compared to the previous one in the change of welfare. So overall, the women are going to improve their welfare. So the main reason for this is because of the preferences and this elasticity that I estimating. So some women may, regardless if there's free childcare, maybe they still prefer to taking care of their children themselves. So because of this, we don't see a lot of a huge decline in the share of informal employment, but we do see an increase in their welfare. Okay, so now this is the last slide. So what's the main thing here, or what I did here? So I examined this interplay between working hours and informality, which I think it's extremely important for Mexico and in the case of Latin America as a whole. To do this, I estimate two different shocks that are going to impact women labor supply choices. One shock is going to be the motherhood, like having a child, and the other one is what's going to happen if actually you lose childcare. And the most important thing here, and the main contribution, I think, of this paper is that I show that this demand for shorter hours is more effective satisfied in the informal sector rather than a specific occupation, especially if we compare to all the previous work done by the US or in Europe. But I think kind of the last thought here, it's about the role of different policies that target labor market regulations versus subsidized childcare. And I think right now is really important because the expansion of subsidized childcare is going to be extremely costly for the government, right? But maybe if the goal is to reduce informality, maybe that's not the way to go. But so maybe a more cost-effective solution, we actually be thinking about changes in the labor market regulations, but allowing firms to actually reduce the cost of hiring an additional worker. So maybe with this, they increase the hiring of formal workers. So with this, we're going to be a bigger reduction in a larger reduction in the informal sector compared to the subsidized childcare, but the welfare overall will be different here. So I'm done now. I'm sorry I took like 5 more minutes for this. But yeah, so let me know if anyone has questions. I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you very much, Angélica, for your presentation. The data you have shared with us, both interesting and revealing. Before we continue, I would like to introduce Dr. Antonio del Rio, Director of the Center for Mexican Studies, UNAM in the United Kingdom. He will be joining us to moderate the Q&A session and to share the closing remarks. For those who would like to participate, please feel free to leave your question in the chat section. Go ahead, Dr. Antonio.
Thank you, Grecia. Thank you very much, Angélica. It's really, I enjoyed your talk. Really, it's amazing the work that you have done. And I have a few questions, but first we can go to the question from the YouTube channel. They say, Jaime Castel asks, how do your findings contribute to the broader debate on gender equality in labor markets in Latin America?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. How do your findings contribute to the broader debate on gender equality in labor markets in Latin America?
Yeah. Wow, that's important. Thank you. So I think, sorry. Yes. So I think as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, and I should make more clear, is informal jobs are not good jobs. I'm not saying we should move people or women to the informal sector because they found flexibility there. No, because we know that on average, they have lower earnings. We don't have social safety nets. And most important, we're not going to have pensions, right? So these jobs are not good jobs. So if we allowed or if we think about like actually reducing informality or let me say this again. The reason why women are sorting into the informal sector, one channel, is because they need this flexibility. They need these shorter hours, not because they like the informal sector as a sector. So because of this, we see a lot of gender disparities because women are more likely to be in the informal sector. So let's create a formal sector or let's create jobs that actually give us these shorter hours or jobs that give us more like this flexibility that women may need in the formal sector. If we start moving women, especially women with children, from informal to formal jobs, this is going to decrease the gender is going to increase the gender inequality because now we're moving them from a formal sector where they will have access to pensions. Again, this is extremely important, social security, and higher incomes. So just by doing that, we're going to see a decline, reduce the gender inequalities in Mexico and Latin America because informal sector is huge in both. So again, I don't say that informal sector is good and lets women stay there. It's just given that women like this because of this flexibility, let's put flexibility in the formal sector. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. There is another question. No, but I have a very for me why surprising that the child care stations are not good policy measure. Is surprise, and the fact that you show that reducing the hours working is a better policy, or flexibilize the schedule of working, maybe. I would like that. How you feel to find that is better to have flexibility formal jobs in order to improve the quality of the woman works?
Yes. So these two policies are not exactly policies that are in place. These are policies that the government can think. So the results differ in the sense that by allowing formality more flexible, the women want to stay formal and they can adjust this intensive margin in the formal sector. So they will be better off because they have higher earnings. That means they can potentially spend more money in childcare. But on the other hand, they cannot spend time with their children in their house, right? So there's this like preference happening there. But if the government only care about increasing formality, this is the most important one. Just because the women need the shorter hours and formal jobs are better. So by putting more shorter hour jobs, women remain formal. So, or they wouldn't move to the informal. So that's why formality will increase. The other policy, it's talk more about preferences. That's why the share of formality doesn't change that much. Because here you have this interplay saying like, okay, now there's subsidized childcare, meaning I can put more hours my kid in daycare. Maybe it's not that expensive, but this is not going to affect my labor market choices that much. That's why women, they're still not going to be moving to the formal sector. But because of this preference of maybe I prefer to take care of my children myself, or because of quality, or all of that, that's going to impact welfare of women more. But overall, the share of formality, it increases, but not increase as much as actually targeting labor market regulations.
Okay, thanks. And I think that you have worked with another data with other countries. Can you compare Mexico with another countries, not in Latin America, maybe in other places, Europe, Africa, or any other countries?
Yes. So two things. I think one of the main comments that I also receive, it's if it's coming from informality or self-employment. These results are coming from informality, and I show that it's not self-employment. So that's one thing. And that's why if we think about like Africa, maybe this thing will be like a different story just because self-employed is where women work most of them. And self-employed there is mainly informal. But we think about just data. One of my other projects is about childcare in the US. So the main comment here is childcare in the US has increased a lot. The price of childcare in the US has increased a lot. And actually, one of my papers shows that by increasing the share of the price of childcare, women in the US have actually decided to leave the labor force or actually reduce the number of hours because it's again this trade-off, like it's so expensive, I cannot pay it. So maybe I reduce the number of hours that I can work so I can take care of my children because I cannot pay for childcare. But in the case of the US, maybe they're going to switch occupations, for example. In the case of Mexico, it's not that the price of childcare has increased a lot. It's just like there's not a lot of childcare. And if there's childcare, it's expensive. So women actually, that's why they use informal sector, so they can reduce the number of hours work. In case of the US, they will actually have to change the occupation, meaning from being lawyers to just, I don't know, real estate, that maybe that's like another type of occupation that is more flexible. But all of this is coming, again, it's the same story. The same story is about childcare. Childcare is so expensive in the US, women cannot afford it. They exit the labor force, or they adjust it, or they reduce the number of hours work, or they switch occupations. And in Mexico, the case will be like, I need to take care of my children. I cannot, I don't have enough hours in the formal sector, or I have to reduce the number of hours in the formal sector. The formal sector doesn't allow me. I switch to the informal sector because I can do it there. So, yes.
Thank you, Angélica. I have another question from the YouTube. Octavio Martínez is asking, what is the difference in salaries between women in the informal sector and the formal sector? And said without considering the cost per hour.
Yes. So, oh God, that's a good question. I have it in my paper, but I think so. Something interesting is the difference in salaries is smaller for women than for men. So, women in the informal sector, of course, earn less than the women in the formal sector, because informal jobs have lower earnings. But this difference is smaller than for men. So actually, there's a larger earnings differential for men than for women. But yeah, on top of my head, I don't have it.
Okay, we invite Octavio Martínez to read your papers.
Yes.
Yeah. And Farid Bustos asks, if these informal jobs were forced to formality, looking more like self-employment, how would that affect the job flexibility?
Yes, if it were forced to formality. Well, I think that's the main thing. It cannot be forced, right? We can actually, so the firms have this decision of hiring work. Imagine that you can hire 2 workers part-time and 1 worker full-time, and assuming that they have the same productivity. But if I have to hire 2 workers, regardless if they're part-time or not, and it's more expensive than one full-time worker, the worker is not going to do it. The firm is not going to do it, because every time you hire in Mexico, sorry, let me start. In Mexico, the cost of hiring a worker, it's a sunk cost, like a fixed cost, plus a variable cost. So this initial fixed cost it's for certain firms, it's so high that they prefer just to hire full-time workers instead of 2 part-time workers. So we cannot force them, but if we reduce the cost for firms, maybe this is going to kind of allow them to hire more workers, and they will be formal. So this is kind of like push them a little bit to that. And with this, if there's more firms that want to hire part-time workers, this is where the flexibility in hours comes from. So yeah.
Okay, the other question Farid asks is, will the formation of state-funded childcare will be feasible for non-flexible jobs?
Oh, the formation of the state fund feasible for non-flex. If it's not, I don't know. It also depends how does this state-funded childcare we're thinking about. So first of all, I think it's a really bit everyone would like to have subsidized childcare, but it's one of the most expensive policies that any country in the world can put. And again, you're right, like how will this be feasible for non-flexible jobs? What if, even though it's universal, what if it's only 9 to 4? And then you have to work to 8 to 6. You still have to reduce this. So maybe it would be, it depend how this universal childcare, we think about it, it will be feasible or not. But like we can think of cases where it not be feasible and cases where it be feasible, but it's kind of like the first step towards like let's increase childcare so at least some women can actually use be benefit from this, but it will depend on the specifics of it. Yep.
Okay, one result that I surprised me in your child penalty graph was the change in the formality rates in women around the age that the child entered to the elementary school. Can you, for me, it's surprising how the children are going to school and then the formality rate relatives are really, really big.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the, I think one of the limitations about these studies in child penalties, especially because here I'm creating like a pseudo panel, is like as time passes, is not that precise. But here, this effect, it's only taking into account the first child. But as time passes, maybe women has 2 or 3 or more children, right? So I think even though everyone wants to analyze these long run effects, as time passes, given that this is like a pseudo panel, is not going to be as precise. But I think the important thing here is I'm comparing with men. So these are going to be imprecise or less precise, but also comparing to men, men still is going to be flat around 0. So there's no changing there, but for women there is. So it's like, and also I think one of the problems with informality is once you transition, it's quite persistent, this state. So once you transition from formality to informality, it's less likely that you move back to formality. So once you're in the informal sector, the probability of you changing back, it's really low.
Thanks, Angelica. I really will very happy and look at your details in your model. But you claim that your model is static, is in equilibrium. And could you imagine how can you study the dynamic in these kind of models?
Yes, so it's just static because it's just like a one-time decision. So you have, so my individuals are heterogeneous in terms of preferences and productivity. So imagine that they received, it's a tuple, and then you have certain preferences, certain productivity from the formal sector, and certain productivity in the informal sector. So based on this, you make, and based on the wages and prices, you make a decision. And you're in that point. That's why it's static. And then it's like, okay, what would happen if suddenly you changes this type of, you include this type of policies? By making dynamic, I don't think, at least in this model and in this paper, I think already is a little bit complicated right now. Adding dynamics here, I don't think this model right now, it's not for like a dynamic model, given that I'm starting to the point that you already made your choice based on the character, how many children you have, all of that, and then you see how to you react to a policy. So that's why it's static. It's like I'm here, there's this policy, how I'm going to change. I think dynamics will be more about like, okay, maybe I have a children, what will happen if I have another one, or it will be like changing decisions little by little, but it's not going to help me given that it's like I'm in this point, I have this policy, how I will react. I think that's why it's the important thing here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Angelica. I think that it's time to say thanks to all the audience, and especially thank to you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. No, thank you, you for inviting me. It has been a pleasure. Maybe next year I will come back with another one.
Yes, why not? Yes, of course. And let's say thanks to everybody And I would like to thank the participants who joined us, both from Mexico and UK and the other parts of the world. These seminars are designed to foster dialogue and showcase the talent and contribution of younger researchers. We invite you to stay connected with the Center for Mexican Studies in UNAM, UK, and also thank you, the Mexican Society of Students in UK. And we are waiting for you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.